Story number 1.
It was supposed to be the perfect road trip. My best friend Karen and I had been planning it for months. Just the two of us, hitting the open road and driving from Denver down to Santa Fe. The plan was simple: explore small towns, stop at quirky roadside attractions, and leave behind the stress of our day-to-day lives. Karen and I were close, but we both had our share of life's challenges. The road trip was our way to break free and recharge. We set out early one morning, eager to get on the road. The sun was still low in the sky, and the roads were quiet as we cruised along. We drove through the mountains, enjoying the view and the simple joy of being together. The weather was perfect, and the music played softly in the background as we chatted about everything and nothing. By the time we hit the outskirts of a small town called Marlow, the sun had started to dip below the horizon. It was getting late, and we decided it was time to stop and grab a bite to eat. There was a small diner on the corner, tucked away on a side street, its neon sign flickering weakly in the twilight. We pulled into the parking lot, and the quiet of the place felt oddly comforting. Inside, the diner was dimly lit, the only sounds coming from the clink of silverware and the low hum of an old jukebox. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with graying hair and a faded apron, greeted us with a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She led us to a booth by the window and handed us menus, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. The diner felt frozen in time, as though nothing had changed in years. Karen seemed unfazed, but I couldn't stop looking around. The place was small, almost claustrophobic, and there was a musty smell in the air. The tables were made of worn wood, and the checkered floor tiles looked like they hadn't been cleaned in days. There were only a few people inside, an older couple at the counter, and a man in a flannel shirt sitting alone near the back. The man was staring down at his coffee, not saying a word, his face hidden in shadow. The waitress left us alone to decide, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I noticed the walls were decorated with old photographs, black and white pictures of people from a different era. There was something about the faces in those photos that unsettled me, as though they were staring right at me. Karen caught me staring at one of the pictures and followed my gaze. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice soft. I shook my head. Nothing. Just, this place is weird. She laughed lightly, brushing it off. "You're just tired. It's been a long day. Let's just enjoy the food." I forced a smile and agreed, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the air. We ordered sandwiches and settled in to eat, trying to make small talk, but I couldn't stop glancing at the man in the corner. He hadn't moved, his face still hidden in the shadow of his hat. As we ate, the jukebox played a soft, haunting melody, and I noticed the older couple at the counter were no longer speaking. They were both staring at the man in the corner, their eyes wide and unblinking. It was as though they were hypnotized, unable to look away. I tried to ignore the growing sense of discomfort, but it was impossible. Something about the man in the corner felt wrong, like he didn't belong there. It wasn't just his silence or the way he sat there, motionless. There was something more. Something about the air in the diner had shifted. Suddenly, the man lifted his head, and our eyes locked. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. His eyes were dark, too dark, hollow, almost soulless. He didn't smile, didn't say a word, but the look he gave me was enough to make my stomach turn. I quickly looked away, feeling a cold sweat break out on my neck. Karen, sensing my discomfort, reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded, but I wasn't sure. Something wasn't right. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked back at the man, but he had already turned his gaze back down to his coffee, as though nothing had happened. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I tried to push the feeling down, to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when the waitress returned to check on us, she glanced nervously at the man in the corner and then quickly looked away. She avoided our eyes, not meeting our gaze, and mumbled something about the weather before hurrying off. I didn't want to linger any longer, but I also didn't want to make Karen feel uncomfortable. We finished our meal quickly, and I paid the bill, eager to get out of there. The whole place felt wrong, like we had stumbled into a time warp, and I had no intention of staying longer. As we stood up to leave, I caught a glimpse of the man in the corner again. This time, he wasn't looking at us. He was staring at something outside the window, his expression vacant. The older couple at the counter had left, but the silence in the diner remained heavy, almost suffocating. We stepped out into the cool evening air, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The quiet of the town was almost deafening after the eerie tension inside the diner. We got into the car, and I started the engine, eager to put miles between us and that strange place. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The diner's neon sign flickered one last time before going dark. I sighed, thinking that maybe I was just being paranoid, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. It was like something had followed us out of that diner, a shadow that lingered just out of sight. We continued driving, and after a few more hours, we reached a small motel on the outskirts of Santa Fe. I was exhausted, but the strange events of the evening kept me awake. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the corner and the look in his eyes. It felt like he had been waiting for something, waiting for us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the motel building, every gust of wind made me jump. I kept thinking about the diner and the feeling of being watched, and I couldn't shake the image of the man's dark eyes. I tried to convince myself that I was just tired and that it had all been in my head, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, Karen and I were both quiet as we packed up and left the motel. I didn't mention my discomfort from the night before, but I could tell she was feeling it too. The drive into Santa Fe was uneventful, but neither of us said much. A few days later, after we'd spent some time sightseeing, we decided to head back to Denver. On the way, we passed through the same small town of Marlow, and I suggested we stop for gas. As we approached the diner, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. I wanted to drive right by, but Karen insisted we stop for a quick break. When we pulled into the parking lot, I was surprised to see that the diner looked completely different. The neon sign was gone, replaced by a weathered, faded sign that read, "Closed." I looked around and realized the whole street was deserted. The gas station was closed too, and the town seemed abandoned. I got out of the car, my curiosity getting the better of me. I walked over to the diner's front door, which was ajar. Inside, it was empty, completely empty. The tables were overturned, and the once dim lights were now completely dead. The jukebox sat in the corner, covered in dust. As I walked further inside, I felt a chill in the air. I wasn't alone. I turned to look behind me, and standing in the doorway was the man from the diner. His dark eyes locked onto mine. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel his presence in every inch of the room. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. I rushed back to the car, my heart racing. I didn't look back as I climbed in, and we drove out of Marlow without saying a word. I never went back to that diner, and I never spoke about it again. But every now and then, when I drive along an empty highway, I catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A shadow that shouldn't be there. Story. The end.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a fun road trip. My best friend Claire and I had been planning it for months, just the two of us, driving across the Midwest. We'd packed our bags, set our playlist, and left our busy lives behind. Our route took us through winding roads, small towns, and isolated stretches of highway that promised a sense of adventure. The first few days were everything we hoped for. We laughed, played music, and explored quirky little towns. But as we drove further into the less populated areas, something started to feel off. It was the second evening of our trip when things started to take a strange turn. We had been driving for hours, the sun setting behind us as the sky shifted from orange to a deep purple. We were in Nebraska, heading towards a small town called Willow Creek, where we had planned to stop for the night. We had seen the sign for the town a while ago, but now the landscape felt eerily empty. The road stretched out before us, surrounded by vast fields and the occasional dilapidated barn. "Do you think we'll make it before dark?" Claire asked, glancing at the dimming sky. "It feels like the sun is going down so fast." I checked the GPS. "We should be there in about 20 minutes. Plenty of time." We kept driving, the road twisting and turning, but with no sign of Willow Creek yet. The empty expanse of land stretched endlessly, and I could feel a creeping sense of unease settling in. It was just the kind of place where you expect to find an old ghost story or a local legend, but I brushed it off. It was just my imagination running wild. As we neared what I thought was the town, I glanced out the window again, looking for the first signs of civilization. But there was nothing. No houses, no streetlights, not even a car. Just the road and fields. I checked the GPS again. The map showed that we were in Willow Creek, but it looked wrong. Where is everyone? Claire asked, her voice soft with confusion. Where are the houses? The lights? There should be something. I slowed the car down, glancing at the abandoned storefronts that lined the road. The windows were dusty, and the signs looked like they'd been forgotten for years. There was an old gas station on the corner, its lights flickering dimly, but the pumps were rusted and unmoving. The place felt deserted. Let's stop at that gas station, I said, trying to shake off the discomfort that was slowly creeping over me. Maybe someone can tell us what's going on. I pulled the car over to the gas station, but as we stepped out, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There was no one around, not a single person in sight. It was dead silent, not even the wind rustling the dry grass nearby. Hello? Claire called out hesitantly, her voice echoing into the emptiness. No answer. We walked toward the small convenience store attached to the gas station, but when we tried the door, it was locked. I checked the windows, and though the store was still stocked with goods, it seemed completely abandoned. There was no sign of anyone inside. This place is so strange, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't like this. I agree, I replied, turning to head back to the car. Let's just get out of here. We'll find another place to stay. But as we made our way back to the car, something stopped me. A sound. A soft tapping, like footsteps, coming from the direction of the gas station's storage shed behind the building. It was faint, but it was there. Did you hear that? I asked, my heart beginning to race. Claire nodded, her face pale. Yeah, I did. It sounds like someone's back there. We both stood still for a moment, listening. The tapping continued, soft and rhythmic. The longer I stood there, the more unnerved I felt. Something about it seemed wrong, like it was meant to get our attention, to pull us in. Should we check it out? I asked hesitantly, already knowing the answer. No, Claire replied quickly. No way. We need to leave. We got in the car and drove off, the tapping sound still faintly in the background, but the further we got, the more it faded away. As we left Willow Creek behind, I glanced at Claire, who looked just as rattled as I felt. We didn't say anything for a while, both of us lost in our thoughts, but eventually Claire broke the silence. That was weird, right? She said, her voice tight. It's like that town was stuck in time. I nodded. Yeah, it felt off, like something wasn't right there. We shouldn't have stopped. We drove for what felt like hours, the emptiness of the road swallowing us whole. Eventually, we came across a small, modest motel on the outskirts of another town. We decided to stop for the night, hoping the experience would fade with sleep. The motel was quiet, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the night air. It felt like the kind of place where time didn't really move forward. It just stayed in one place. As we checked in, the clerk, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, barely looked up from his desk. You two need anything? He asked, his voice flat and uninterested. No, just a room for the night, I said, trying to keep the conversation short. Room 3, he said, handing me the key with an almost mechanical gesture. The room was small, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that seemed to cling to the fabric of the bedsheets, but at least it was quiet. We settled in, turning on the TV to try and distract ourselves, but the static on the screen made it impossible to watch. The lights flickered, and the air conditioning rattled in the corner. Claire turned to me after a while. I can't shake this feeling. It's like something followed us. I didn't answer right away. I felt the same way. It was as if the eerie presence of Willow Creek had lingered, like we had brought it with us. Let's just get some sleep, I suggested, trying to calm my racing thoughts. We'll leave first thing in the morning. But when I turned off the lights and pulled the blanket over me, I couldn't fall asleep. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, the strange town, the sound of footsteps, the eerie feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard it again, the soft tapping. It was coming from the hallway outside the room. I held my breath, listening. The sound grew louder, closer, like footsteps moving in slow, deliberate steps. I whispered to Claire, "Do you hear that?" She didn't answer at first, but then I felt her hand gripping mine. "Yes." The tapping stopped right outside our door. Neither of us moved, both of us holding our breath, listening intently. Then the door handle turned, slowly, almost as if someone was testing it. I froze, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I whispered, barely able to speak. No answer. The door handle stopped moving. For what felt like hours, we stayed in that silence, each of us too afraid to move or say anything. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps faded away. We didn't sleep that night. Neither of us could. The next morning, we packed up as quickly as we could and left the motel. We didn't even stop to get breakfast, just hopped into the car and drove, the sun rising as we put miles between ourselves and the motel. We never spoke of it again, but I couldn't forget that feeling, that tapping sound. And whenever I look back on that road trip, I know one thing for certain. There's something about those quiet, forgotten places, those towns on the edge of the map that you should never linger in, because sometimes the silence hides more than you think. Story the end.
Story number 3.
We were driving through a stretch of highway that I hadn't planned on. It was late, and the winding roads leading into the desert were far quieter than I had imagined. The sun had set hours ago, leaving only the ghostly light of the moon to guide us. My best friend, Emily, was in the passenger seat, dozing off while I kept my eyes on the road. We had been on the road for nearly 12 hours, our initial excitement about the road trip starting to wear thin. We had taken a spontaneous route, deciding at the last minute to follow a random turn off the interstate. I thought it would be fun to explore smaller towns, discover places that weren't on the maps, but in hindsight, it had been a mistake. This part of the highway was desolate, with no signs of life for miles. "I think we should stop for the night," Emily murmured, stretching and rubbing her eyes. "We're not getting anywhere fast, and the road feels weird." I nodded, a sense of unease creeping over me. The stretch of road we were on was surrounded by desert, and there were no gas stations or motels in sight. I was starting to feel the weight of being so far from civilization. "Just a little farther," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "There's got to be something ahead." But the miles passed, and there was nothing but the endless stretch of darkness. I could feel the car's headlights cutting through the vast emptiness. But there was no sign of life, no other vehicles, no buildings. It was as if we had entered some forgotten corner of the world. Emily sat up straighter, her eyes scanning the empty horizon. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing toward a small light in the distance. I squinted. It looked like a single flickering light, barely visible against the vast open expanse. The road curved ahead, and as we got closer, the light seemed to grow brighter. "I think it's a gas station," I said, trying to make sense of it. We hadn't passed one in hours, and the idea of filling up and taking a break seemed like a relief. When we finally reached the light, we saw a small, weathered building with a flickering neon sign above it. The sign was partially broken, and only one word was still visible: gas. The gas station was old, the kind of place that hadn't seen business in decades. It seemed like a relic from another time. The gas pumps were dusty, the glass on the windows was cracked, and there were no other cars in sight. It felt abandoned, like a forgotten place in the middle of nowhere. Emily turned to me, her voice barely audible. "Are you sure about this?" I hesitated. There was something off about the place. The air around the gas station seemed still, too still, and the flickering neon light cast an eerie glow over the cracked concrete. But we were both tired, and I knew we needed fuel to keep going. "We'll just fill up and leave. It'll be fine," I said, trying to reassure both of us. I pulled the car to the pump and stopped, noticing that there wasn't any other car in sight. Emily stayed in the car, looking out the window nervously while I stepped out to begin fueling. The wind picked up slightly, and the desert air was dry and cool. It felt as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in just a few minutes. As I stood there, pumping gas, I noticed something strange. From the corner of my eye, I could have sworn I saw movement near the small building behind the station. I glanced toward it, but saw nothing, just the shadowy outline of the building against the moonlit sky. I dismissed it as my imagination, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on me. After finishing, I walked around to the front of the car to pay. but the station attendant was nowhere to be found. The door to the small shack was slightly ajar, and the light inside flickered intermittently. I walked up to the door and knocked, but there was no response. Maybe it's automated, I thought aloud, stepping back and turning to Emily. I could see her in the passenger seat, watching me with wide eyes. "Can we just go?" she asked, her voice tight. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I had the unsettling feeling that something wasn't quite right. We hadn't seen anyone since we pulled up, and the stillness of the place felt unnatural. As I got back into the car, I heard a faint sound from behind us, a soft tapping noise like the sound of footsteps on the gravel. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped around, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of empty highway. "Did you hear that?" I asked Emily, my voice shaking. She nodded, her face pale. "I did. It's coming from behind the station." I didn't want to check it out. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "Just drive," I said, my voice urgent. "Let's just go." I started the car, the engine growling to life, and backed up slowly. As I pulled away, my eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the gas station lot. It was tall and gaunt, wearing a dark cloak that seemed to blend with the night. It was motionless, watching us as we drove away. I slammed my foot on the gas, pushing the car faster down the road. I didn't look back. Emily was silent beside me, her hands gripping the seat. Neither of us spoke for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt. The further we drove, the more I realized that I had no idea where we were. The roads were becoming more unfamiliar, and the sense of isolation grew heavier with each passing minute. Eventually, I pulled off at a small rest area to stretch my legs. The place was empty, no other vehicles in sight. As we stood there, looking out into the night, I saw something in the distance, another flicker of light, just like the one from the gas station. This time, it wasn't a gas station, it was a house, a small, dilapidated building tucked away behind a row of trees. The light was dim, and I couldn't make out any details, but I felt the same strange pull toward it, like an invisible force was guiding me. "Do you see that?" I asked Emily, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her face drawn with fear. "Yeah, it wasn't there before." I didn't know what it was, but it felt like we were being drawn into something we couldn't escape. It was as if the road itself was leading us down a path we were never meant to follow. Emily and I decided not to stop. We got back in the car, and I drove, my hands gripping the wheel. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the oppressive feeling of being watched never left us. We didn't speak about what happened at the gas station or the strange house we'd seen. The silence between us was thick, and the longer we drove, the more I realized that whatever we had experienced out there, whether it was real or imagined, wasn't something we were going to forget. By the time we reached the next town, the sun was rising. The road had finally brought us back to some semblance of normalcy, but the unease lingered. We didn't talk much after that, but I could tell that Emily was thinking the same thing I was. Some roads are better left unexplored. Story the end.
Story number 4.
They had been on the road for what seemed like days, even though it had only been a few hours. The car hummed steadily, the engine whirring in perfect rhythm with the sparse, empty highway. The three of them, Emma, Dave, and Mike, had been planning the road trip for months. The idea was simple: hit the road, explore some small towns, and end up somewhere beautiful. Their destination was a remote lakeside cabin, but the journey was supposed to be just as important. They wanted to take in the open road, the unknown stops along the way, and the freedom of getting away from the routine. It was late afternoon when they passed through a small, almost forgotten town. The kind of place that didn't appear on any maps, its faded welcome sign barely visible as they cruised through. The buildings were old, most of them abandoned, with broken windows and cracked facades. The few cars that were parked on the side of the road looked like they hadn't moved in years. They had stopped for gas at a dilapidated station on the edge of town, and that's when they met the man behind the counter. His name was Ray, a wiry figure with a scruffy beard and a weary, distant look in his eyes. He had greeted them with a gruff "evenin'" and handed Dave the gas pump without saying another word. But there was something strange about him. He wasn't unfriendly, but the silence between them felt oppressive, as if he was unwilling to engage, yet somehow he had an air of knowing something they didn't. After paying for the gas, Emma, who had been staring out the window at the desolate street, caught sight of something that made her freeze. Across the street, standing on the cracked sidewalk, was a woman. She was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress that looked out of place, even in this forgotten town. Her hair was dark, almost black, and it cascaded down her back in loose waves. But what made Emma's stomach twist was the way she stood, perfectly still with her eyes fixed on the trio. The woman didn't blink, didn't move a muscle. It was as if she were waiting for something. Emma nudged Mike, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you see her?" Mike looked, squinting in the dying light. "Yeah, I see her. Weird, huh? Think she's some sort of local? Let's just get back in the car," Emma said, like unease crawling up her spine. As they climbed back into the car, Emma kept her eyes on the woman. She felt the weight of those eyes on her, piercing through the windshield. A chill ran down her back. But when they drove away, the woman didn't move, didn't even seem to notice the car pulling away. The rest of the drive was uneventful, though a palpable tension lingered in the air. Dave tried to lighten the mood with some music, but none of them seemed to be in the mood to laugh. Even the wide, open road ahead didn't bring the usual sense of freedom and adventure. It was getting dark by the time they left the town behind and reached a stretch of road that wound through a dense forest. The air had turned cold, the trees looming like shadows as the headlights of the car illuminated the path ahead. There was something eerie about this part of the journey. The silence in the car deepened, and Emma, staring out of the window, could swear she saw movement in the trees. "Hey, Mike, do you see that?" she asked, her voice tight with unease. Mike didn't look right away. "What? It's just some trees. Relax." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way the trees seemed to move unnaturally, the flickers of shadow just at the edge of the headlights. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting from one side of the road to the other. "Let's stop," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I don't like this." Mike shot her a look. "What's wrong with you?" "We're almost there." But Emma insisted, and eventually Mike pulled off the road, finding a small clearing just beyond the tree line. They sat in the car for a few moments, the only sound the hum of the engine and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Do you think the woman back in town was real?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? Of course, she was real," Dave said, his tone dismissive. "It's just some weird local woman, probably a tourist attraction or something." Emma frowned, but didn't argue. She wasn't so sure anymore. Something about the way the woman had stood there, staring at them with such intensity, gnawed at her. "I don't know," she said. I don't like it." "Well, let's get back on the road," Mike said, starting the car again. But as he shifted the car back onto the main road, the headlights caught something in the distance. Like a figure stood at the side of the road, just beyond the trees. It was her, the woman. The same white dress, the same hair, and once again, standing perfectly still, watching them. "Shit," Dave cursed, his hands gripping the seat. "What the hell is she doing out here?" Mike slammed on the brakes, and the car came to a screeching halt. They stared at the woman, who didn't move, didn't blink. She was no longer just standing at the edge of the road. She was walking towards them, slowly, deliberately. "I don't want to stay here," Emma said, her voice high with panic. "Please, let's go." But Mike, despite the unease building in his chest, couldn't bring himself to drive away. Something about her presence, the intensity of her stare, had frozen him in place. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. "Mike," Dave warned, his voice low and anxious. "Don't." The woman was closer now, so close that they could see her face, pale and gaunt. Her eyes were hollow, dark sockets staring into them with an unearthly depth. She smiled then, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was twisted, unnatural. And in that moment, everything shifted. The world around them seemed to distort, the trees twisting in the shadows, the road itself curling like smoke. Suddenly, the temperature in the car dropped drastically, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Emma felt her breath catch in her throat, the cold seeping into her skin. The woman's smile widened, and the darkness around them deepened. And then the woman spoke. "Leave," she whispered, her voice a low, raspy hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For a moment, the three of them were frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. The woman's form began to blur, her figure dissolving into the shadows of the night. "Go," she repeated, louder now. "Leave, or you will never leave." Mike's hands were shaking on the wheel. He tore his eyes away from the apparition and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The car shot forward, speeding down the dark road. As they drove, the lights of the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by the night. Emma glanced nervously into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing in the middle of the road, watching them drive away. But there was nothing. The rest of the journey was silent. No one spoke a word as the car sped through the winding roads, passing through stretches of dark forest and empty fields. It wasn't until they reached the cabin, a small, secluded house nestled by a serene lake, that the tension in the car finally started to ease. But as they stepped out, Emma noticed something that made her heart race all over again. The woman was standing at the edge of the woods just beyond the cabin, her white dress glowing faintly in the moonlight, and once again, she was watching them. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the endless stretch of highway that cut through the remote desert landscape. Emily and Jake were on their way home after a week-long road trip, winding their way back from a visit to a distant national park. They had taken a route less traveled, hoping to enjoy the serenity of the open road without the usual bustle of traffic. The air inside their car was still warm from the day's heat, but a cool breeze had started to sneak in through the cracks of the slightly open windows. "It's going to be dark soon," Emily said, glancing nervously at the empty road ahead. "How much longer until we hit the next town?" "About an hour, I think," Jake replied, his eyes glued to the road. "We've got plenty of time. Just need to stay focused." Emily was quiet for a moment, staring out at the vast expanse of desert on either side of them. It felt like they were the only ones left in the world. The occasional cactus or rock formation was the only sign of life for miles. "How does it feel?" she asked softly. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Being out here. Alone. It's kind of eerie, don't you think?" Jake chuckled. "You're such a city girl. It's peaceful out here." Emily sighed. "I guess. But the silence feels wrong in a way. I don't know, it just feels like we're being watched." Jake turned to her, his face momentarily serious. "What do you mean? Like, by who?" "I don't know," she said, her voice growing softer. "It's just a feeling, like there's something out here with us." Jake didn't answer immediately. He only focused on the road, but Emily could tell he was trying to shake off the same unease she was feeling. They both fell silent, and the only sounds in the car were the hum of the tires against the pavement and the occasional creak of the engine. The further they drove, the darker it became. The highway was now swallowed up by the night, the darkness of the desert consuming everything around them. Jake flicked on the headlights, the beam illuminating only a small sliver of the road ahead. "I think I saw something," Emily said, breaking the silence. Jake glanced at her, his eyes wide. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, it was just a flicker of movement on the side of the road," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Maybe it was an animal or something." Jake slowed the car, his attention now fully focused on the dark road. "I don't see anything." They continued driving, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the car seemed to grow heavier, and the shadows around them began to feel more oppressive. It was as if the desert was closing in, tightening around them like a vice. After a few more minutes, Emily looked out the window again, her heart skipping a beat. "Jake," she whispered urgently, "there's something on the side of the road. It's standing there." Jake glanced out the window, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. At first, he saw nothing but the darkness, but then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something. Someone standing just off the shoulder of the highway. A figure. Tall, pale, almost ghostly. "Keep driving," Emily said, her voice a frantic whisper. But it was too late. The figure stepped into the path of the car. Jake slammed on the brakes, sending the car skidding to a halt. They both gasped, staring at the figure now standing in front of the car, illuminated by the headlights. It was a man, but not a man in the way that they knew it. He was gaunt, his skin a sickly shade of white, his clothes tattered and worn. His hair was long, tangled, and wild, and his eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to swallow the light. The man took a step toward the car, his feet dragging in the sand as if he were struggling to move. His gaze never left them, and Emily felt a chill creep down her spine. "Who the hell is that?" Jake muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice shaky. "But we need to get out of here." Jake hesitated, his foot hovering over the accelerator. The man took another step, and Emily could hear his breathing now, slow and labored, as if each breath was a struggle. The air in the car seemed to grow colder, and the darkness outside felt even more suffocating. "Go," Emily urged. "Now." Jake didn't need any more encouragement. He slammed his foot on the gas, and the car lurched forward, leaving the strange figure in the dust. They sped down the highway, the man now a distant silhouette in the rearview mirror. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. It was as if someone, was still with them, watching them from the darkness. For the next 20 minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the hum of the car's engine and the tires rolling over the pavement. Emily's eyes kept darting to the side windows, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. But the road ahead remained empty. Eventually, Jake broke the silence. "That was weird, right?" "Yeah," Emily replied, her voice trembling. "That guy, he looked dead." "I don't know," Jake said, his voice low. "Maybe he was just some drifter. It could have been some kind of hallucination. We've been driving all day, after all." "Hallucination?" Emily shot him a disbelieving look. "Jake, that man was real. And I don't care what you say, he wasn't just some drifter." Jake didn't reply. He kept his eyes on the road, but Emily could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. He was just as freaked out as she was, but he wasn't willing to admit it. Another hour passed, and they were both exhausted. The quiet hum of the road had become almost soothing, and the unease they'd felt earlier began to ebb. But then, as they neared a sharp bend in the road, something strange happened. The car's headlights flickered, then dimmed, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. The engine sputtered for a moment before it surged back to life. Jake frowned. "What the hell was that?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" "See what?" "There, out there, in the road." She pointed frantically out the window. Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he followed her gaze. In the distance, just past the bend, stood the same man. The gaunt figure was there again, waiting in the middle of the road, as if he'd been waiting for them all along. "Go, go, go," Emily screamed. Jake slammed his foot on the accelerator, but the car didn't move. It was as if the engine had stalled, refusing to obey him. The figure in front of them took a step forward, then another, his pace slow but deliberate, his hollow eyes locked onto them, unblinking. Jake cursed, frantically pumping the gas pedal. The engine sputtered again, and the car jerked forward, barely moving. Emily's breath was coming in ragged gasps. "Jake, what's happening?" "I don't know," he shouted, his face pale. "The car won't start." The figure was closer now, so close that they could hear the rasp of his breath, the dragging of his feet across the road. Emily felt her skin crawl, her blood running cold. She looked around frantically, searching for any sign of help, but there was nothing. No one. Just the endless road and the dark, empty desert. Suddenly, the car lurched forward, the engine roaring to life again, and Jake slammed his foot on the gas. The car shot forward, leaving the figure behind. Emily turned around in her seat, watching as the man slowly faded into the darkness, his form dissolving like mist. They didn't stop driving until they reached the next town, a small, isolated place that looked like it had been frozen in time. Emily didn't say a word as they pulled into a gas station. She couldn't shake the image of the man from her mind, his hollow eyes burning into her soul. Jake got out of the car and walked toward the small convenience store, his shoulders slumped. Emily stayed in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. When Jake returned, his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "You won't believe what I heard," he said, his voice trembling. Emily raised an eyebrow. "What?" Jake swallowed hard. "The man we saw, he used to live here, a long time ago. He died on this road. They say his spirit still haunts it, waiting for anyone who dares to pass by." Emily's heart stopped. "How do you know that?" Jake stared at her with wide eyes. "I asked the clerk inside. He said it's an old legend, but people still swear they see him." Emily shuddered. What do you think? Jake didn't answer. He only stared out into the desert as if he could still see the figure standing just beyond the headlights.
Story number 6.
It started as a simple road trip. My best friend Mia and I had been planning it for months. We both wanted a break from our hectic city lives, so we decided to drive through the back roads of the Southwest. A few days of scenic views, good music, and open highways sounded perfect. We were driving along a stretch of Route 66 that was known for its small towns and dilapidated motels. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the horizon. It was the kind of peaceful, golden hour light that makes everything feel surreal. But that's when things began to feel off. We had passed a small, barely visible sign that read, "Welcome to Desert View," a town that wasn't on our planned route but seemed like it could be an interesting stop. We decided to pull in, hoping to find a place to grab a bite to eat and stretch our legs. As we drove down the main street, I noticed how empty it looked. The shops were closed, and the houses were far apart with no lights on in any of the windows. The air felt unnervingly still, almost oppressive, as if the town was holding its breath. Mia, do you think this place is even open? I asked, my voice tinged with uncertainty. Don't know, she replied, her voice equally unsure. Let's just drive around a little more. Maybe we'll find something. We kept driving slowly until we came across an old rundown diner on the edge of town. The neon sign outside flickered, but the open light was glowing dimly. It was the only sign of life, so we decided to stop. The diner had a musty smell when we walked in, and the few tables inside were scattered with papers and old menus. The waitress, a woman with dark circles under her eyes, barely acknowledged us when we entered. She just nodded curtly and led us to a booth at the far end of the diner, her footsteps heavy on the worn tile floor. I noticed that the diner was nearly empty, except for an old man sitting in the corner, hunched over a cup of coffee. His back was turned and his gray hair blended with the dim lighting. He didn't seem to notice us as we sat down. After we ordered, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I looked around the diner again, trying to pinpoint the source of my unease. That's when I noticed it. The walls were covered in pictures, old black and white photographs of the town, some of which included a woman I didn't recognize. She appeared in nearly every one, standing alone in front of different buildings or on the edge of the highway. Her face was expressionless, and her clothes looked old-fashioned, like something from the 1950s. I felt a chill run down my spine. Mia noticed me staring at the photos and followed my gaze. "That's strange," she said quietly. "Why are there so many pictures of her?" I didn't have an answer, but I couldn't look away from the pictures. The woman's eyes in each photo seemed to follow me, and an unsettling thought started to form in my mind. Was she real? Or was this some kind of ghostly presence that had become embedded in the town's history? The waitress returned with our food, and we tried to push the strange thoughts aside, focusing on our meal. But the silence in the diner was palpable, almost suffocating. Even the old man in the corner seemed like he was part of the scene, like he belonged in the photograph itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything around us was stuck in time. Just as we were finishing our meal, the waitress came back and, without saying a word, placed the bill on the table. Her eyes didn't meet mine, but she gave us a nod, almost like she was urging us to leave. Something in her demeanor made my stomach twist with anxiety. "Let's go," Mia said, her voice lower than usual. We paid and left the diner quickly, but as we stepped outside, something was different. The sky had darkened much faster than it should have, and a thick fog had rolled in, swallowing up the street in a haze. The only thing visible were the faint outlines of the buildings and a few dim streetlights. "Mia, this is weird," I said, my heart starting to race. "This fog wasn't here a minute ago. It's too thick." "I know," she replied, her voice filled with unease. "Let's just get back in the car and go." We hurried back to the car, and as I started the engine, I realized something else. The town was silent. There were no sounds, no birds, no wind. It was as if the entire place had been swallowed by the fog, leaving only us behind. I turned onto the main road to head back out of town, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. No signs, no turns, just the same straight path with the fog growing thicker the further we went. My headlights barely cut through the haze, and I couldn't see anything beyond the immediate area around the car. "I don't like this," I muttered, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "What's going on?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. "Where's the way out?" "I don't know," I said, my voice growing frantic. "This doesn't make sense. We should have been out of here by now." I hit the gas, but it didn't seem to make a difference. We just kept driving straight, with no sign of anything changing. Then I saw it. Just ahead of us, standing by the side of the road, was the woman from the photos. My breath caught in my throat. She was wearing a long dress, her hair blowing in the wind, but her face was just as cold and emotionless as in the photographs. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the car. "Mia, do you see her?" I gasped. Mia didn't answer. She was frozen, her eyes wide in terror. I slammed on the brakes, but when the car came to a stop, the woman was gone. My heart was pounding, my body cold with fear. What the hell was that? "I don't know," Mia stammered, her face pale. "I saw her too, but where did she go?" I looked around frantically, but the fog was still thick, and I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of the car. I tried to start the car again, but it sputtered, refusing to turn over. "We're stuck," I said, panic creeping into my voice. "What's happening?" Suddenly a sound broke the silence, a loud knock on the window. I jumped, my heart racing. I looked to my right, and there she was again, standing next to the car. Her pale face was inches from the glass, her eyes wide and dark. She didn't speak, just stared as if waiting for something. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse and floored the gas pedal. The car jerked back, the tires screeching on the road. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, the woman was still there, standing motionless in the same spot, as if she had never moved. We drove blindly through the fog, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't know where we were going or what we were running from, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't breathe. Finally, after what felt like hours, the fog began to thin. The road stretched out in front of us again, and I could see the faint outlines of the town disappearing in the distance. I pushed the car faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. There was nothing to say. We both knew that something unnatural had happened in Desert View, something that we couldn't explain. As we drove farther away, the town seemed to fade, but the image of the woman's eyes, the cold, unblinking stare, would stay with me forever. When we reached the next town, we stopped at a gas station. The attendant, a young man, looked at us with confusion when we asked about Desert View. "Desert View?" he said, scratching his head. "That town's been abandoned for decades. There hasn't been anyone living there for years." My blood ran cold. "But we just came from there." The attendant gave me a strange look, like I was crazy. "There's nothing there now, just some old ruins. People say it's haunted, though. Some people still see things there." I couldn't speak. I was too stunned. We never spoke of Desert View again, but I know what I saw. I know the woman was real, and I know that sometimes when you're driving on the open road, you may stumble across places that aren't quite as real as they seem. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
We had been planning the road trip for months. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. A week-long drive down the coast, exploring small towns, quirky diners, and hidden spots along the way. Nothing extraordinary, just a break from the daily grind. It was me, Jack, and our best friend, Sarah. We'd been inseparable since high school, and this trip felt like the kind of adventure we'd been dreaming of for years. We set off on a crisp Thursday morning, the sun barely rising above the horizon. The highway stretched before us, a ribbon of concrete leading us toward new places. The first few days were everything we'd hoped for: great weather, the open road, and plenty of laughter. We spent time at roadside attractions, took too many photos, and drank coffee at every stop. It was a much-needed escape, and we were all starting to feel the freedom of it. But then, things began to change. It was on the third day, when we were nearing the small town of Glen Hollow, that the oddness started. We had been driving for hours, and the highway was eerily empty. We passed through a thick stretch of forest, the trees so dense they almost felt like they were closing in on the road. There wasn't another car in sight, not for miles. The air felt heavier, the kind of heaviness you feel when a storm is about to break. But the sky remained clear, almost too clear, as though it were holding its breath. We decided to stop at a small diner off the side of the road. The sign out front was faded, the lights flickering like it had been abandoned for years. But hunger got the best of us, and we pulled into the gravel lot. The place looked run down, with cracked windows and peeling paint. The door creaked when I opened it, and the bell above it chimed, startling us. Inside, the diner was dark and smelled like old coffee and dust. There was only one other person in the place. An older man sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of something. He didn't look up when we walked in, just kept his gaze fixed on his drink. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with a stern face, appeared from behind the counter and gave us a nod. She didn't smile. "Sit anywhere," she said, her voice gruff. We chose a booth near the back, and as we slid into the worn vinyl seats, Sarah looked around nervously. "This place feels weird," she whispered, her eyes darting from the empty booths to the man at the counter. Jack shrugged. "It's just a diner, Sarah. Let's eat and get back on the road." But I could see what she meant. There was an unsettling stillness about the place, like the air hadn't moved in years. It wasn't just the rundown appearance, it was something deeper, something unspoken. The waitress took our order without saying much, and after a long silence, she brought us our food. The pancakes were cold, the bacon greasy, but we ate in silence, the weirdness of the place settling over us like a thick fog. After we finished eating, we paid and headed back to the car. But as we walked toward the parking lot, I caught sight of something strange in the rearview mirror. It was the man from the diner, standing just inside the door, watching us leave. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his face, it was pale, almost sickly. But what struck me was the way he was standing. He wasn't moving, just staring at us, his hands pressed against the glass. I glanced at Sarah and Jack, but neither of them seemed to notice. They were already getting into the car, eager to continue the trip. I shook my head and turned the key in the ignition. We drove off without saying much, the feeling of unease lingering in the air. The town of Glen Hollow was behind us, and the highway stretched on, empty and silent. The next few hours were uneventful, but the atmosphere had shifted. Sarah was quiet, staring out the window, and Jack kept fidgeting with the radio. It was as if the energy of the road had changed, and something was pulling at the edges of our minds. We didn't talk about it, but we all felt it. When we finally pulled into a small, dilapidated gas station near a patch of woods, the sun had begun to dip low on the horizon. We needed fuel, and the station was the only one for miles. The pumps were ancient, and the attendant, a thin man with hollow eyes, barely acknowledged us as we filled the tank. He wore a faded green cap and a stained shirt. His voice was low, almost like he was talking to himself when he told us the price. "You folks from around here?" he asked, his eyes flicking toward the woods in the distance. Jack shook his head. "Nah, just passing through." The attendant's gaze lingered on us a moment longer before he muttered, "Careful around these parts. Not everyone who drives through these woods makes it out." It was such an odd thing to say, and it immediately set off a wave of discomfort in me. Sarah stiffened next to me, her eyes wide as she glanced nervously toward the trees. Jack, though, laughed it off, clearly not taking the warning seriously. "We'll be fine," he said, smiling. "Thanks for the tip." The attendant didn't respond. He just turned and walked back inside the small, rundown station. We finished up and got back in the car, but the feeling of being watched never left. We drove into the woods, the trees closing in on us like something out of a nightmare. The road twisted and turned, and the car's headlights barely cut through the thick darkness. It was so quiet now, even the usual hum of the tires on the pavement seemed muffled. At one point, the radio flickered and went silent, even though the dial showed it was still on. The car seemed to grow colder, and every now and then I thought I heard something moving outside the windows. Branches scraping against the glass, the rustle of leaves like something was following us. I turned to Sarah. "Are you all right?" She didn't answer right away, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "Did you see that?" she finally asked, her voice shaking. "In the mirror," I frowned. What are you talking about?" "Someone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was someone behind us. I saw them in the mirror." I turned around, but the road was empty, just the dark trees lining both sides. "There's no one there," I said, trying to calm her down. But she was insistent. "No, I saw them. They were in the road, right behind the car. I swear I saw them. The unease from earlier came flooding back. I told Jack to pull over, thinking we could stretch our legs or take a break, but when he slowed down and came to a stop, there was no sign of anyone. "We're just getting tired," Jack said, trying to brush it off, but even he seemed uneasy now. "Let's just get back on the road." We continued on, but I could see Sarah in the back seat, staring at the road behind us in the side mirror. Her grip on the door tightened, and she looked as though she were about to say something. But before she could speak, the headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat. He wasn't moving, he just stood there, staring directly at the car, his face a blur in the headlights. Jack slammed on the brakes and the car skidded to a stop. The figure didn't move. It was like he wasn't even there, just a shadow in the middle of the road. "What the hell? The hell?" Jack said, his voice filled with disbelief. We all stared at the figure, but it was Sarah who finally spoke. "Go, go, go," she screamed. Jack threw the car into reverse and sped away, the figure vanishing in the rearview mirror as we tore down the road. The rest of the drive was a blur. We didn't stop again, didn't talk, just drove as fast as we could until we finally reached the next town. We didn't mention the man in the road again, but we all knew what had happened. We'd felt it. Something had been watching us, something that had been waiting for us to drive through the woods, and maybe, just maybe, it didn't want us to leave. When we reached the motel that night, we checked in quickly and locked ourselves in the room. As I lay in bed, the feeling of unease never left me. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever we had seen wasn't something that belonged in the world we knew. The next morning, we left without a word about the night before, but none of us ever spoke of that road trip again. Some experiences, we realized, were better left buried. Story the end.